The big idea for today's lesson: how can you use measurements to solve real-life problems? I can use the Pythagorean Theorem is our I can statement for today. And at the end of the lesson, the question we want to answer is, what is the relationship among the legs and the hypotenuse of a right triangle? So what do we know about the Pythagorean Theorem? We know that the sum of the squares of the lengths of the legs is equal to the square of the length of the hypotenuse. So all of that can be put into a nice, neat little formula. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. And this is called the Pythagorean Theorem. So how do we use the Pythagorean Theorem? Well, you always want to start off by writing the Pythagorean Theorem out. So always write A squared plus B squared equals C squared on your paper. You physically must write it down. The second thing you need to do is you need to look at your right triangle and label all the sides. This case, we already have C labeled for us, so we're going to label A and B so we know which side is which. And with the legs, it doesn't matter which one is A and which one is B. But the longest side, the hypotenuse, must always be C. After we have written the Pythagorean Theorem out, after we have labeled each side, we're going to do substitution. So we're going to take the numbers that we know and substitute them in for the variable. So I know that A is 9, so I'm going to put 9 into the equation, so 9 squared plus. I know that B is 12, so I'm going to substitute that in for B, 12, so I'm going to have 12 squared. I still do not know what C is, but I'm going to continue to write C squared on the board. It's very important that I continue to include that. Now, if you recall to earlier in the year, we're simply solving an equation. 9 squared is 81. 12 squared is like 12 times 12, which is 144. And all of that is going to equal C squared. When I add 81 and 144, I get 225. That's correct. So now 225 equals C squared. So now how can I go from C squared to just C? Well, I have to undo the squared, or undo this exponent. In order to do that, I have to take the square root. If I take the square root of this side of the equation, I also have to do the square root of the other side. When we're solving equations, we have to do the same thing to both sides. The square root and the square will cancel each other out. I'm left with C equals, and if I find the square root of 225, I will find that that is 15. So this answer to this Pythagorean Theorem problem is the length of side C, or the length of the hypotenuse, in this case, is 15. Now, we always want to double check. We said that C is the longest side. Is that the case? I want to make sure that the answer I get is longer than the other leg. So it's longer than 9, which is good, and longer than 12. If for some reason I got an answer that was shorter than one of the legs, I would know I made a mistake. Let's look at one more example. I'm not going to solve this one all the way through to completion, but I want to make sure you know the most important steps. The most important step, number 1, is to write down the Pythagorean Theorem. Number 2 is to label the sides. So I know what C is, so I'm going to label A and B. And then step number 3 is to substitute the information we know into the formula. So 12 squared plus 16 squared equals C squared. And now we simply need to solve. Now, those two examples were pretty straightforward, but sometimes the Pythagorean Theorem changes. And now, if you notice, we are told what two sides are, and we don't know what B is. And so that changes things up a little bit, but if we follow the same pattern, we can still be successful. So once again, we start by writing down the Pythagorean Theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared needs to be on your paper. Then we're going to label the sides. Well, this time we know what B is. We have to label A and C. Well, we know that C is always the hypotenuse. It is always the longest side. So 24 must be C. And by process of elimination, we know that 8 would be A. So we have number 1 written out, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Number 2, we have labeled the sides. And then number 3, we need to substitute into our equation. I know that 8 was A, so I'm going to have A squared. Now this time, notice that we do not know what B is. So we keep B in the equation, and we do know the hypotenuse. We are aware of what C is. It's 24, so we have 24 squared. Okay, so we have written out the Pythagorean theorem. We have labeled all of the sides of our right triangle. We have substituted what we know into the equation. Now we solve. 8 times 8, or 8 squared, is 64, plus B squared equals, what's 24 squared? Well, 24 times 24 equals 576. So this is where it is slightly different. In the previous examples, you started adding A and B together, but now we have to do a little extra work to get B by itself. But once again, you guys being experts in solving equations, this should be a piece of cake. In order to get B by itself, I'm going to subtract 64 from both sides. Once I do that, I'm going to be left with B squared equals 512. And then once again, in order to get B by itself, I don't want B squared, I just want B. I need to take the square root of both sides, and I will find that B equals 22.6. So B equals 22.6. Does that make sense? Well, let's think about this for a second. 24 is C, or our hypotenuse. That should be the longest side, and B should be less than that, which it is, which means we're doing okay. The next example should be very similar. This time, as you can see, they have told us 2 of the sides, and we do not know what A is. So let's go through the same process. Number 1, always write the Pythagorean theorem on your paper. Number 2, label the sides. Well, they have A for us. Now we have to determine which one is B and which one is C. Well, remember, C is always the longest side. So in this case, C is going to be the side 33. That is our hypotenuse, which means by process of elimination, once again, 28 is going to be B. Now we substitute. We don't know what A is, so we're going to keep A squared. They told us that B was 28, so that's going to be 28 squared. They told us that C is 33, so that is going to be 33 squared. And just like the previous ones, you are going to solve these out to completion. In this case, 28 squared is 784. A squared, make sure you continue to include that in your equation. 33 squared is 1,089. To get A by itself, we need to subtract 784 from both sides. Remember, in an equation, what we do to one side, we have to do to the other. And we're left with A squared equals 305. Once again, in order to get A by itself, I take the square root, and A equals 17.46. Now, I do believe in the instructions, it tells you to round to the nearest tenth. So in this case, we would say that A equals 17.5. Okay, hopefully this will help. Please work on the got it problems. I believe there are 3 of them, A, B, and C.